While creating my racial autobiography, I had a lot of time to reflect on my past and the current situations that I'm going through now and realize that not everything was as positive as I remember. My family is Trinidadian and my parents are both Trinidadian, but my mom is also Venezuelan. My brother and sisters are also Trinidadian, and we grew up definitely knowing that our family was from Trinidad because we were always around the music and the food, and I wouldn't change anything about it. My dad grew up in Trinidad, in San Juan, but my mom grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I think my dad probably had the least exposure to a bunch of different races just because where he grew up was a majority of like black people, but my mom in Brooklyn was exposed to more races, just not to a great extent, seeing as the area she grew up in was a majority black people. The ideas I grew up regarding like race relations were, I had white friends when I was younger, so it was never really something I thought about, but growing up, it was very apparent that you should not date outside your race, especially when my parents were younger. I've always thought of myself as black because that's what I am. It's pretty important to me because it's not just about my skin tone at this point. It's about the way I carry myself too. Because if you see a black person in public acting out, they're automatically stereotyped to be that loud black person or that disrespectful black person. Or if I go outside in baggy clothes, I'm automatically assumed to be a thug. I didn't really grow up in like a typical neighborhood when I was younger living in Brooklyn, but the people in our block were definitely all from different races. We had African families, the family next door was Spanish, we had white people next door, there was us, and there was just a different melting pot of a lot of different groups, and we always celebrated together with barbecues, and I absolutely loved it. I think the first encounter with another race was definitely, my neighbors, they were white, and I think those probably were the first white people I've seen just because they lived next door. And they definitely helped raise us as kids. They were always there to help take care of us. They helped my Nana all the time. They're still my Nana's next door neighbor, so whenever we go to Brooklyn, we get to see them. I think that the first time I heard any racial slurs was definitely in Brooklyn because the N word was used, constantly. That's just how black people greet each other. It was never the hard ER, but I think the first time I heard the hard ER was probably from my parents and them explaining to me what it was, why you shouldn't say it, and just why people used it. So I went to two different elementary schools, the first one being PS 203 and the second one being Johnson Park Elementary School. PS 203 was the school I went to in Brooklyn, and it was a majority of other black kids just because that's what most of Brooklyn is black people. The only people that weren't black were most of the teachers and a few of the students, but I think I've had one white kid in my class growing up in Brooklyn. When I moved to Johnson Park, almost everyone was white except for me and a few other kids. All the teachers were white, and there were about I was the only black person in my class, but I did take courses that were supposed to help me with math and English, and it was all black kids in those classes. I think for the curriculum, we didn't really talk about any black Americans aside from the most popular ones, such as Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, which I think is kind of, it's not surprising, but it's definitely something that happened just because that's everyone, when you hear those names, you think, oh my God, they were so influential, but there were definitely a lot more black people around their time, and even before that, that were definitely influential as well. Cultural influences, like in the entertainment area and religion, God was never really given a color in my family. It was just someone who was talked about as a higher being. Angels and Santa Claus were always portrayed as white, but growing up, all the dolls that I played with were mainly black. We also did have white ones, but a majority of the dolls I did play with were black. The racial makeup of my high school was definitely a lot more diverse than my elementary school and my middle school, just because as we got older, the high school mixed with the Cranberry Middle School in this area because they don't have their own high school. So a lot of the kids from there were going to our school. We had a lot of Asian students, we had a lot of black students, white students, Latino students, so it was a good mix of everybody. There was definitely interracial dating in my high school, seeing as I am in one of those relationships, but there were other students dating outside their race as well. I think the use of racial slurs in my school became a lot more prominent very quickly just because there were there were a lot of big incidents where we actually ended up on the news for the racist stuff that the kids were saying. I think the first incident was the Nazis versus Jews beer pong, where the Star of David and the swastika was used to play beer pong, and the pictures were posted, and it put a huge divide in the school because a lot of the students were like, oh my God, it's fine, it's just a game, where the rest of us were kind of pissed off because it's messed up and it's disgusting. There was another incident where a girl was calling someone a nigger, and she was telling them to get to the back of the bus. There were other students where girls were posting it on Snapchat, and there was it was a mess, but there was one student who would be the one to kind of expose all this because she was tired of tired of letting our school allowing these students to get away with it because they were usually just a slap on the wrist. But once we ended up on the news, that was when they finally took action about everything happening. The area that I live in now is a lot of rich white people, just because that's what this area is rich white people. A majority of the homes here sell for millions of dollars, but the neighborhood that I live in is a lot of Indian people, Asian people, black people, white people. I think it's more diverse than a lot of the areas in Princeton, but most of the people here are upper class white people. My group of friends is definitely very diverse, and I really appreciate that because it means our experiences will never be the same. We get to talk about our different cultures, share our different experiences, and I think something like that is very meaningful, especially in society today. An incident that I went through that definitely stuck with me was when I went to the mall. I noticed that the security guard was following me right from the moment I walked in to the moment I left. And the one store I went into, there were people who were walking in front of me, and the employee was greeting them. She was smiling at them, and then I walked in, and she stopped smiling, and she kind of just ignored me, and I was like, whatever, I really don't care, because I'm just here to go shopping. So as I was going shopping, I noticed that she was kind of like following me around with her eyes the entire time I was there. And the minute I went to the back of the store, she couldn't see me. She got up and followed me to watch what I was doing. She watched everything I touched, everything I picked up. And when I went to go check out, she asked me for my stuff, and I handed it to her. So when I gave her my card and she was like, "Where did you get this?" I didn't really know what to say because I was kind of confused as to why she was asking me where I got my debit card. So I didn't answer her, and before I could say anything, she asked me for my ID. So I took out my ID, and she checked it, and she was like, "Do you realize how much money all this stuff is?" And I said, "Yes, I realize how much money this stuff is. I just want to pay for it and leave." And then finally, she hands me back my stuff, and I take my things and leave. As soon as I walk out the store, the security guard is there, and he was like, "Can I ask what's in your bag?" And I basically told him, "I noticed you've been following me the whole time. You need to leave me alone." And I was so upset at that point that I just wanted to go home, so I left the mall. Obviously, he followed me out, but something like that stuck with me because so many people think stuff like that isn't happening, when in reality, stuff like that happens to people all of the time. I've never felt privileged when it's come to my race, but I've definitely felt grateful for how hard my parents worked to get us to where we are now. We went from living in my nana's basement to our tiny two-bedroom apartment to our first townhome in Jersey and to the larger townhome that we're living in now. And all the things that my parents gave me, I know they worked extremely hard for. And I know how hard they worked to get us to where we are. They moved us out here for the education. And it's just nice to see how hard that they worked to get us where we are. I've never felt threatened in terms of like someone I was afraid of, but I've definitely felt pressure around being black because there's so many things you can't do as a black person because if you do them, then you automatically fall underneath the stereotype.